We often think surprise decides a war first punch, the unexpected blow, the burning ships in a harbor. But sometimes the outcome is written long before the first bomb falls, in ledgers and fuel charts nobody wants to read. It's 740, 2 on 7 December 1941, 230 miles north of Oahu. On the flight deck of the carrier Akagi, the Pacific swell lifts and drops 6 Japanese carriers in slow rhythm. Around Commander Minoru Jender, pilots and deck crews are laughing, hugging, shouting to be heard over idling engines. They have spent 12 days crossing the North Pacific in radio silence. Now they have struck Pearl Harbor and gotten away. They believe they have just changed history. Jender listens to their stories and smells the mix of hot oil, aviation fuel, and salt spray in the morning air. He has spent 11 months designing this operation training schedules, attack formations, target priorities, ordnance load. He has memorized numbers others only glance at, and as he watches the second wave aircraft recover, the math running through his head tells a completely different story. A story in which, even as Japan wins the most spectacular tactical victory in its naval history, it locks in a war it cannot win. Minutes earlier, Michio Fuide's strike leader brought his aircraft in and reported to Vice Admiral Chuichi Inagumo, mission complete. The American Pacific Fleet has been crippled. The tally backs him up. 4 American battleships sunk outright. Arizona blown open so violently that fragments of steel rained down a quarter mile away on Ford Island. Oklahoma rolled 150 degrees to port, completely capsized, trapping more than 400 men in her overturned hull. West Virginia and California settled into the harbor mud, superstructures still above water, hulls ripped by torpedoes. 4 more battle wagons wrecked. Nevada beached to avoid sinking in the channel. Pennsylvania wounded but repairable in dry dock. Maryland and Tennessee battered, trapped behind capsized sisters. 18 ships in total destroyed or crippled. On the ground, American casualties are horrific. About 403 dead, hundreds wounded. Japan's losses, by contrast, are tiny. Out of 350, 3 aircraft launched, only 20. 9 are missing, 90 fighters, 5 torpedo bombers, 15 dive bombers. Barely 8%. By any conventional measure, it is an overwhelming success. On Akagi's deck, men who left home not knowing if they would return are giddy with relief. They slap each other's backs and shout over the roar. The tension of the 12-a-day approach from Hitakopu Bay in the Kurils, south through stormy seas under strict radio silence has snapped. They have done the unthinkable. They have hit the Americans in their own main base and lived. Jender stands slightly apart. At 37, he is already one of the Imperial Navy's sharpest aviation tacticians. Since January 1941, he has worked under Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto to shape every detail of this morning's strike. He has trained pilots in new torpedo profiles, overseen trials of modified ordnance, helped choreograph dozens of aircraft over a single, crowded harbor. He should be elated. Instead, he looks south toward O, who he cannot see, and thinks not about burning battleships, but about oil barrels. About fuel curves he has drawn in the margins of planning documents. About storage tanks he knows are still standing, untouched. He thinks about the difference between what looks decisive and what actually keeps fleets moving. Everyone around him is focused on the battleships. The photographs that will be taken tare columns of smoke. Superstructures healed over will fix those great hulls as symbols of American defeat. But Jender knows the big-un ships are already sliding toward obsolescence. The future of naval war belongs to platforms like the one under his feet and to the long, lean shapes that prowl beneath the surface. Carriers and submarines, not slow lines of armored turrets. And the real center of gravity at Pearl Harbor this morning is not on Battleship Row. It is a few thousand yards inland on the eastern side of the naval base in 3 clusters of cylindrical steel. About 4.5 million barrels of fuel oil sit in above, ground storage tanks there. 49 massive cylinder, thin-walled, riveted, painted, easy to see from the air arranged in 3 main farms built over decades as the Navy expanded. The lower tank farm, constructed between 1913 and 1923, holds about 1,400 zero barrels in twin-tit woe tanks of varying sizes. The original 5 tanks from 1,913 carry between 50, and 50 barrels each. 17 more added in 1,920. 3 hold 50 barrels apiece. The middle tank farm holds roughly 500 barrels in 10 tanks. The upper tank farm, the largest, holds about 500 barrels in 17 tanks each of those big units able to store 150 barrels. Together, they are the entire fuel stockpile for the United States Pacific Fleet. Years from now, Admiral Chester Nimitz will say bluntly that Pearl Harbor held 4.5 million barrels of fuel oil that morning again that all of it was vulnerable not just to bombs but to 50 caliber bullets. The tanks are built for efficiency, not survival. They sit above ground, side by side, to minimize piping runs and make peacetime operations easy. Nobody conceived of them as wartime targets when the first ones went up. From the air, they are obvious. Japanese reconnaissance has seen them. For months, a consular official operating under the alias Tadashi Morimurarial name, Toko Yoshiwaz, watched Pearl Harbor from the ground. From the Japanese consulate in Honolulu, he has studied which ships come and go, counted aircraft, noted where repair docks and dry docks lie, and where the long lines of fuel tanks stretch. Every week, he has sent coded reports by commercial telegraph back to Tokyo. The attack planners know exactly where the oil is. Those tanks are extraordinarily fragile. Their walls are thin steel plat thick enough to hold liquid at atmospheric pressure, not thick enough to shrug off explosions. An armor, piercing bomber even a 500-pound Generalp. Pose bomb does not need to hit perfectly. Any serious hit will open a tank like a can. Fuel oil is not gasoline. It does not detonate in great fireballs, but it burns hot long. A ruptured tank would spill a lake of oil that would ignite and keep burning for days. The heat from one blazing tank could soften and buckle adjacent walls, even if they remain unhit. Fire would spread from shell to shell until the entire farm became a roaring mass of flame. Once the first tank is opened and burning, the complex is essentially doomed. All 5 million barrels gone. The fleet combined carries about 760 barrels in its bunkers and oilers, roughly 1/16 of the stockpile on shore. In the 9 days after the attack, American search operations scouring for the Japanese carriers in vain and securing the approaches to Hawaii will burn through about 750 barrels, almost the entire seaborne capacity. Without the shore tanks, the Pacific Fleet would be dry in just over a week. Completely immobilized, Gender knows what that would mean. The use would have no choice but to abandon Pearl Harbor as a forward base. Every battleship, every cruiser, every destroyer would have to fall back to San Diego, San Francisco, or Seattle more than 20 miles away. From California, every sortie toward the western Pacific would cost twice as much fuel just reaching and leaving the combat zone. A destroyer that can operate 10 days in the Philippines when based at Pearl would manage 4 from San Diego. The operational reach of every ship would be cut in half. Sustained operations west of Midway, let alone in the Philippines, Malaya, or the Dutch East Indies, would be impossible for at least a year, probably more. The U.S. would need years to rebuild fuel storage in Hawaii. 4.5 million barrels of tankage doesn't appear overnight. Every new tank would need foundations, steel, welding crews, and behind that, new pumping stations, new pipelines, new firefighting systems. All while fighting a Tushin war. And yet, as Akagi's deck crews strip bombs and refuel aircraft for a possible third strike, Gender knows something else with cold certainty. Not one Japanese bomb has fallen on the oil tanks. The attack plan Nagumo's staff has executed does not include them as priority targets. Pilots have not been briefed on their importance. No ordnance is reserved for destroying them. The dive bombers and torpedo planes have spent their explosives almost entirely on battleship starts that look decisive, that burn dramatically, but are already slipping out of the center of naval warfare. The carriers, the submarines, the dry docks and repair basins, and most critically, fuel storage itself are either absent that morning or, in the case of the tanks, ignored. This is not a fluke. It is the visible edge of miscalculations made months earlier in quiet rooms miscalculations about what actually wins naval wars, and more fundamentally, whether Japan can afford one at all. Captain Kamito Kurashima, senior staff officer to Yamamoto, is one of the men who tries to run those numbers before anyone leaves port. He's an odd figure even by naval staff standards, known for working naked in his cabin because he claims clothes distract him from thinking, eating almost nothing but enormous bowls of rice, able, his colleagues say, to recite from memory the fuel capacity and cruising range of every major warship in both the Japanese and American fleets. In early 1941, as Pearl Harbor is still only a sketch on maps, Japanese naval planners face a single fundamental question: can Japan sustain a war against the United States? The answer hinges on petroleum. Japan imports about 90% of its oil. In peacetime, the country consumes roughly 32 to 37 million barrels per year across all U.S. civilian, Army, Navy. Most of that comes from the United States and the Dutch East Indies. On 26 July 1941, after Japanese troops move into southern French Indochina, the United States imposes an oil embargo. Britain and the Dutch government in exile follow. Overnight, Japan is cut off from more than 80% of its petroleum imports. By September, the empire has about 50 million barrels in strategic reserve, spread across Navy storage, Army depots, and civilian stocks mandated by a 1934 law. The Imperial Navy alone is burning approximately 900 barrels per hour in routine operations, nearly 70 barrels a day. About 4 million barrels per year just for the fleet. Add the Army, add civilian needs. At that pace, the 50 million barrel cushion shrinks fast. Without new sources, the calculation is brutal. Japan runs out of fuel for major military operations sometime in 1943. The country faces two choices: yield to American demands, withdraw from China, dismantle the Greater East Asia prosperity sphere, go to war to seize the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies before the tanks run dry. The Navy chooses war, but that decision leads immediately to a more precise question. Not can we fight, but can we fight long enough to win before the fuel runs out? Kuroshima and others work through the war planning math. They anchor their projections on three major assumptions. Each seems at the time reasonable. Each is backed by doctrine, precedent, or intelligence. Each is wrong. Assumption 1, the war will be short. Japanese leaders, steeped in their own views of American culture, believe the United States will not endure heavy losses. 6 to 8 months of hard fighting, they think, will shock Americans into a compromise zone that leaves Japan in control of Southeast Asia. If that is true, planners only need to cover a short, sharp campaign. Long-term sustainability does not enter the equation. Assumption 2, naval operations will follow the decisive battle pattern that has dominated Japanese strategic thought since Tsushima in 1905. The combined fleet will mostly wait in home waters. The American Pacific Fleet, steaming west, will be drawn toward Japan. There will be 1 or 2 great set-piece fleet engagements in which Japanese gunnery, torpedoes, and night fighting skills will annihilate the enemy. If that is the script, most ships will spend most of their time at anchor. Fuel consumption will be low and predictable. Only a fraction of the fleet will be at sea at any moment. The oil burn will be manageable. Assumption 3, capturing the Dutch East Indies will solve the supply problem outright. The oil fields in Borneo, Sumatra, and Java have produced about 65 million barrels per year in 1940. Military consumption is estimated at 35 to 40 million annually. Take the fields intact, fix what little damage the Dutch do, and those wells will more than cover Japanese needs indefinitely. On paper, with 50 million barrels in reserve and the prospect of adding 65 million per year from conquered fields, the spreadsheet looks optimistic. In September 1941, Kuroshima can run those numbers and show that, in theory, Japan can fuel a war. Jender, looking out over Akagi's deck on 7 December, knows now that every one of those assumptions has already failed or is about to, and that the arithmetic hidden beneath the cheers around him is going to drag his country down, no matter how perfectly his pilots flew this morning. The first assumption, that the war will be shorties within hours of Pearl Harbor. Instead of shock and collapse, the American answer to the burning battleships is fury and resolve. President Franklin Roosevelt calls 7 December a date which will live in infamy and asks Congress for a declaration of war. The vote is nearly unanimous. Across the country, men line up at recruiting offices. Factories begin retooling. Shipyards expand. Within months, the use. Economy shifts to total war production on a scale no Japanese planner has imagined. The conflict that Kurashima modeled as a 6-month campaign turns into a 3-year Andean grind. The time horizon in all his fuel tables explodes. Every mistake in consumption estimates, every gap in supply, every shortfall in tanker capacity compounds. The second assumption, that the Pacific will be decided in a limited number of set-piece surface battles, fails just as completely. The war that unfolds is not Tsushima 2.0. It is something entirely different. Continuous operations across an ocean the size of a planet's face. Carrier task forces steaming thousands of miles to strike at enemy bases and fleets. Submarines ranging deep into enemy shipping lanes for weeks at a time. Amphibious assaults on string after string of islands, each one requiring convoys, escorts, pre-invasion bombardments. Destroyers racing almost continuously between forward bases, escorting troop transports and supply ships, covering retreats, rushing reinforcements. Ships are not sitting at anchor, waiting. They are moving, always, and movement burns fuel. At a peaceful cruising speed of 15 knots, a typical destroyer consumes roughly 100 tons of fuel oil per day. At combat speeds 25 to 30 knots, that burn jumps to 30 or 400 tons per day. Real operations are not conducted at lazy crews. They are conducted with throttles open, turns for new bearings, evasion from air attack, high-speed dashes to catch or flee. Picture one destroyer 2 weeks out to a combat zone, a week of high-intensity action 2 weeks back. In that combat week, she burns as much fuel as in 3 or 4 weeks of peacetime sailing. Multiply that by dozens of destroyers. Add cruisers which drink even more. Add carriers and battleships, their enormous boiler rooms gulping hundreds of tons per day. Add submarines, add the fleet oilers themselves, which burn fuel just to move fuel. The planning assumptions, based on average cruising speeds and limited deployments, are suddenly fantasy. The reality is captured in the numbers Japanese accountants submit for fiscal 1940 to April 1940 to March 1943. Total military consumption 4179 million barrels. Plans had projected 40 million. They are already at the high end during a period when major operations are only just ramping up. In fiscal 1943, consumption rises further to about 43.99 million barrels, this during the peak of fighting in the Solomons, New Guinea, and the Central Pacific. Fuel burn is not manageable and predictable, it's running away. The third assumption, that conquering the Dutch East Indies solves the problem, collides with sabotage and skill shortages before the first barrels move north. When Japanese troops roll into Borneo, Sumatra, and Java in early 1942, they find that the Dutch and British have not simply walked away. They have set their own industrial lifeblood on fire. At Balikpapan in Borneo, Dutch engineers have wired pumping stations with dynamite and blown them. Storage tanks are shattered, their steel sides collapse, charred foundations marking where millions of barrels once stood. Wells burn, flames roaring for weeks. Concrete has been poured down drill strings. Critical components from refineries are unbolted, smashed, or quietly removed and dumped into rivers. Electrical systems are mangled. Pipelines are slashed or contaminated. On paper, some facilities appear intact. In practice, many are crippled in ways that are not obvious until you try to restart them. Missing seals, damaged valves, mismatched fittings, sabotage that takes expertise to spot and time to fix. That expertise is in short supply. The Netherlands and Britain have spent decades developing petroleum engineering for these tropical fields. Japan's own oil industry is tiny. Domestic production from fields in Akita and Niigata is around 3 million barrels a year. The engineering corps supporting those wells is a fraction of what the Dutch and British have. Most Allied petroleum specialists have been evacuated. Those captured are locked in POW camps, not brought into control rooms. Language barriers, security fears, and distrust of enemy nationals make it almost unthinkable to use them as skilled labor. Japan has to send their own engineers south, but universities have not produced them in the numbers needed. Mining engineers can be retrained for some tasks, chemical engineers understand some refinery processes. But the deep, practical knowledge of how to manage reservoir pressure, repair sabotaged drill strings, and tune refinery throughput is thin. Equipment is worse. Oil field hardware is large, heavy, and specialized. Drilling rigs weigh hundreds of tons. Refinery components are precision-built. Pump sizes must match well, and pipeline characteristics. Storage tanks require careful construction. You can't improvise this from scrap and optimism. It must be built, shipped, and installed. The same thin pool of merchant ships that must now carry crude oil north must also carry drilling equipment, replacement pump assemblies, pressure vessels, and miles of pipe south. Each hull loaded with gear for Balikpapan or Palembang is one less hull available to lift oil. And all of those hulls north, bound with crude or refined products, southbound with equipment sale in seas increasingly patrolled by American submarines. American doctrine from early in the war places Japanese logistics high on the target list. Tankers get priority. Every tanker sunk is thousands of tons of fuel that will never fire a boiler or turn a propeller. Every freighter carrying oilfield equipment that fails to arrive is a well or a plant that will not resume production. Submarines wait along the routes from Borneo and Sumatra. They linger near geographic choke points, Luzon Strait between the Philippines and Formosa, chief among them. Tankers and equipment ships cannot bypass these narrows easily. Each passage is a trip through a shooting gallery. Despite Japanese efforts, the production numbers tell the tale. In 1940, before the war in the Indies, the Dutch East Indies produce about 65 million barrels. In 1942, under Japanese occupation, that drops to about 9 million, less than 40% of per-war output. As Japanese engineers and replacements assemble and repair, 1,940, 3 C's improvement, about 6 million barrels. Roughly 76% of what the fields once yielded. By then, though, another bottleneck has tightened. Tankers to move 9 million barrels in a year using 10 zero-dead, weight in tankers carrying about 50 barrels each. A simple calculation applies. Each ship takes about 4 weeks for a round trip from Borneo to Japan at 11-12 knots, including port times. That's roughly 13 voyages per year if nothing goes wrong. 13 voyages at 50 barrels is about 50 barrels per tanker per year. 49 million divided by 975 is roughly 50 tankers dedicated solely to that route, working continuously, never sunk, never in repair, never diverted. In December 1941, Japan has around 49 ocean-going tankers suitable for long-range oil transport, totaling roughly 500 gross tons. Navy tanker, civilian tanker of earthing, that capacity is barely adequate for peacetime when some oil comes from nearby sources and domestic fields. It is catastrophically inadequate when all lifeblood must flow from distant, contested seas. New tankers take 8 to 10 months to build. But Japanese shipyards are already at capacity building destroyers, submarines, cruisers, and carriers. Warships are glamorous. They sink enemy ships. They win battles. Tankers just move oil. They are unglamorous necessities, and in a system where prestige matters, they lose budget fights. Between late 1941 and late 1943, some tankers will be launched, not nearly enough. Meanwhile, submarines go to work. Every tanker sunk is not just lost tonnage, it's increased risk for the remainder. With fewer hulls, each surviving tanker must make more trips to maintain flow. More trips mean more days in dangerous seas. More days mean higher odds of running into a torpedo spread. The spiraling effect is deadly. Losses force tankers to sail on longer, more circuitous routes to avoid known patrol zones. What might have been a 4-week voyage becomes 5 or 6 as captains zigzag, hug coasts, or hole up in coves waiting for an escort. Longer voyages mean fewer annual trips. Fewer trips mean less oil delivered even if no more tankers are sunk. By late 1942, reality is unavoidable. Oil imports are falling not just because production is incomplete, but because the shipping to move that oil is being sunk or pushed into delay. By April 1942, just 4 months after Pearl Harbor, the stockpile tells the truth. Japan's reserves have dropped from 50 million barrels in September 1941 to around 38 million. A loss of 12 million barrels in 7 months. The Navy alone is burning roughly 4 million barrels per month, significantly above the 2 million per month used in initial planning. At that rate, even with optimistic estimates for captured production and rosy assumptions about tanker survival, reserves hit danger zones in 1943, possibly mid-year, as Yamamoto prepares for Midway in May 1942. Staff briefings on fuel are grim. The Naval General Staff in Tokyo convenes emergency meetings through the summer and autumn. Proposals fly. Almost none have workable, timely solutions. Build more tankers. Shipyards are maxed out. Every tanker laid down is a destroyer or cruiser not built, and tankers started now will not be ready until mid-1943 or latter, about when reserves hit critical low. Cut operations, throttle back training flights, cancel exercises, keep ships in port unless absolutely necessary. That saves oil but cedes the initiative. While Japanese ships sit with full bunkers, American industry adds hulls and American pilots add flight hours. Every month of saving fuel is a month of strategic regression. Move major fleet units closer to the oil. Base battleships and carriers at Singapore or in waters near Borneo so they can refuel more easily. This is tried, it saves tanker miles. And it means when decisive fights erupt far away, Midway in June 1942, Guadalcanal beginning in August, Tarawa in November 1943, the Marianas in June 1944, big ships are thousands of miles from where they are needed. By the time orders arrive and ships can steam north, the opportunity is gone. Burn lower-grade fuel, send tankers north with unrefined Borneo crude instead of precious bunker oil, and have ships burn crude directly. This, too, is tried. Crude contains sulfur, salt, sediments. Burning it fouls boilers. Tubes clog with deposits. Heat transfer drops. Maintenance intervals shrink from months to weeks. Some ships suffer boiler failures and have to be towed home. What is gained in tanker capacity is lost in fleet readiness. Develop synthetic fuel like Germany. In theory, convert coal to liquid fuel. In practice, this requires a national-scale investment, special catalysts, specially designed plants, and timely years which Japan does not have. Small pilot projects begin. None reach industrial scale in time. By September 1942, the math is unforgiving. Japanese consumption is averaging about 7 million barrels per month. Imports, even after production improves, cannot meet that burn. The deficit comes out of reserves. Every month, the stockpile ticks down. Analysts estimate that with reserves below about 10 million barrels, the Navy no longer has enough in hand to fight sustained operations. Below that crisis threshold, any large sortie empties the tank with nothing in reserve. Given realistic constraints, about 5 million barrels per year available from captured fields after shipping losses, plus 3 million of domestic output, Japan can't get above perhaps 28 million barrels per year delivered. The minimum to sustain the war as actually being fought is around 40 million. The gap is baked in, roughly 17 million barrels per year short. No clever scheduling will close it. By mid-1943, reserves are around 15 million barrels. American submarines have maimed the tanker fleet. The surviving ships have to take long, wasteful routes. Some of the oil that reaches forward depots ends up burned just moving tankers and escorts around, never making it to a main bunker. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, Japanese carriers operate at the extreme edge of their fuel envelopes. They cannot maneuver freely or run long, complex operations because every extra knot and every extra mile devours irreplaceable fuel. American carriers, by contrast, are topped up at sea by a vast train of fleet oilers. They can sprint, turn, and chase as much as they like. Courage, skill, and doctrine still matter, but all three are now yoked to wildly different resource bases. By late 1944, Japan's oil imports have fallen to a trickle. Most tankers have been sunk. The few that remain are so threatened and worn that many ships sit in harbor with dry bunkers. Orders to sortie become theoretical. There is simply no fuel. In October 1944, in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the Japanese fleet sails in a desperate attempt to crush the American invasion of the Philippines. They pour much of their remaining fuel into that sortie. The plan is not overtly suicidal, but the margin is slim. Many ships limp home near empty. Some operations in 1945 are explicitly one-way. Operation 10, go in April 1945. The final sortie of the battleship Yamamoto is planned as a suicide run to Okinawa. Official orders call for minimal fuel, just enough to reach the invasion beaches, beach herself, and fight as a stationary gun battery until destroyed. Local base commanders at Tokiyama quietly give her more around 60% capacity instead of the absolute bare minimum. Even that is probably not enough to get her back. It does matter. American carrier air groups send her to the bottom on 7 April. By August 1945, when Japan surrenders, oil reserves are essentially gone. Whatever major combatants survive are stuck in port. The oil fields in the Indies still pump. Tanks in Borneo and Sumatra still hold product, but there are no tankers to move it. The deficit that existed on paper in 1941 has fully expressed itself in steel and rust and immobile ships. Admiral Yamamoto has seen this coming from the beginning. On 7 January 1940, when 11 months before Pearl Harbor, writes to Navy Minister Koshiro Aikawa. In that letter, he lays it out plainly. Japan cannot win a prolonged war against the United States. American industrial capacity dwarfs Japan's. American oil production is hundreds of times Japan's domestic output. If the war goes beyond 6 to 8 months, defeat is inevitable. The only conceivable hope, he writes, is a quick, devastating blow that so demoralizes the Americans they accept a negotiated settlement. Even this, he adds, is unlikely because the historical tendency of the United States in war is to become more determined, not less, after an initial defeat. Yamamoto never believes Pearl Harbor will bring decisive strategic victory. He knows the math. He knows the most it can do is buy time and shock. He is trapped, though, in a system where saying no to the politicians and army leadership is not an option. He can mutter pessimism in private conversation. He can write letters that circulate among a few. He cannot stand up in a planning conference and refuse. That would be seen as disloyal, as insubordinate, as lacking fighting spirit. It would end his career and put a more compliant admiral in his chair. So he does what he can. He plans Pearl Harbor as perfectly as possible. He hopes, against his own judgment, that the Americans will react differently this time. On 18 April 1943, over Bougainville, American 30, 8 fighters intercept his transport, guided there by codebreakers who have read his itinerary in decrypted naval traffic. His bomber crashes into the jungle. He dies knowing the fuel crisis is unfolding exactly as he predicted, knowing that no string of tactical victories can outpace the arithmetic of consumption versus supply. Back on Akagi's deck on 7 December 1941, Genda understands a narrower but still critical failure. He knows they have left Pearl Harbor's fuel tanks untouched. He knows that is a tactical mistake. He knows that putting just a fraction of that morning's bombs into those 49 thin-walled cylinders would have bought Japan perhaps 6 to 12 months of additional freedom of action across the Pacific. He also knows something that makes that missed opportunity feel strangely small. Even if they had done everything right tactically that morn and Jiven, if they had sunk all the battleships and carriers, wrecked every dry dock, burned every gallon of fuel in those tanks, Japan would still be facing the same basic math. Japan needs on the order of 40 million barrels of oil per year to fight the war it is in. After accounting for realistic production and transport under submarine threat, it can access perhaps 25 to 30 million. The gap to 15 million barrels per year is a canyon no courage can leap. You cannot power carriers, destroyers, and army trucks with bullshit. Industrial wars are not decided by Elan alone. They are decided by who can keep machines running. Navies do not move on resolve. They move on fuel. The fatal error is not that Nagumo turns his task force north after only 2 waves at Pearl Harbor, leaving tanks and workshops intact. It is not even the narrow choice to focus on battleships over infrastructure. The fatal error is further upstream. It is the decision to go to war in the first place on the back of fuel consumption estimates, production assumptions, and tanker fleet calculations that are demonstrably wrong. Officers like Kirishima and Yamamoto understand pieces of this. They know in their bones that the numbers don't add up. But the institutional culture in Tokyo punishes dissent and rewards enthusiasm. Officers who question approved plans are seen as weak, lacking spirit. The path to promotion lies in telling superiors what they want to hear. Speaking hard truths is career suicide. So the people who do the math stay quiet. The people who don't or who choose to ignore it make the calls. Japan goes to war with projections that underestimate burn at war tempo, overestimate how quickly captured fields can be restored, and ignore how many tankers will be sunk. The story of Japan's fuel crisis is not, at its core, just about oil. It is about a culture that elevates will over analysis, about political pressure that smothers inconvenient arithmetic, about smart officers who know better but stay silent, about leaders who choose comforting illusions over ugly numbers. Captain Kirishima, the eccentric staff officer who drafted some of those assumptions naked in his cabin, survives the war. Whatever he might have said later, the planning record speaks for itself. Minoru Jender survives too. He stays in uniform after the war, eventually becomes Chief of Staff of Japan's Air Self, Defense Force from 1,950, 9 to 1,962. He enters politics. In interview after interview, he returns to the same point. Even if Pearl Harbor had gone perfectly, if every planned target and every neglected target had been destroyed, Japan still would have lost. The resource and industrial imbalance was simply too great. The lesson, stripped of flags and rhetoric, is stark. Wars are not won by courage alone. They are not won by brilliant tactics or even by individual genius at the operational level. They are won and lost by logistics, industrial base, and the mathematics of resources. Japan needed about 40 million barrels of oil per year. It had access to perhaps 25. The war was lost in that subtraction. Everything else, the burning battleships at Pearl Harbor, the carrier duels, the bayonet charges and bans, Akris, was just the long, bloody working out of what those numbers already implied. When nations ignore math because it conflicts with policy, when institutions suppress analysis because it undermines approved strategies, when leaders choose comforting falsehoods over uncomfortable facts, the result is not just defeat. It is catastrophe for sailors in burning ships, for soldiers on starvation islands, for civilians under falling bombs. If this story of oil and arithmetic changed how you see Pearl Harbor, not as a decisive blow, but as the opening act in a war, Japan was never equipped to consider what it says about decision-making today. How often do leaders in any field let what they want to be true override what the numbers actually say? If you want to hear more about the quiet calculations that decide worsenage tables, calorie counts, factory outputs, let me know which campaign or theater you'd like to explore next. Like this video if you think stories like this, where math outvotes myth, deserve to be told. Subscribe and turn on notifications to stay with us as we dig into more battles where the real turning points were measured in barrels, tons, and hours, not just explosions. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Our community spans veterans, students, and history lovers around the world, people who know that keeping these stories alive is one way to keep future leaders from making the same fatal mistakes.